Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Board Games Are for Everybody, and today we are going to be taking a look at Tiny Towns. This was one of the earlier games that we picked up when we started getting board games, and it is one that we have not played in a long time, but one that we really enjoy. So the premise of Tiny Towns is that your town is represented. I'm going to grab these out here. Your town's represented by one of these 4x4 grids. Now we're just going to throw these guys here so we can show how the two-player game works. This is a game for I believe to 6 people. 1 to 6 people. There's a solo player mode. Maybe we will cover a solo player mode someday, but for this video we're going to be taking a look at the multiplayer mode. Now, your town is represented by a 4x4 grid, of which you are placing resource cubes on specific layouts to construct different buildings, and depending on what buildings you build and where you build them, you will be gaining different victory points, and at the end of the game you want to calculate all of your victory points in order to determine who wins the game. Now, each of these different card types are represented by different colored buildings that come with the game. There are a lot of buildings. These guys here, and we've also got our resource cubes. Now, the resource cubes come in 5 different colors to represent 5 different resources. Those being glass, wheat, stone, wood, and bricks, which are our red tokens in here. So the goal of the game is to build buildings based on different layouts by placing different materials onto your board. Now, the buildings that you build are different every game. Every game you will be trying to build cottages. It is one of the standard cards, so it is in every game. However, every other card type has 3 or 4 different things, all with different layouts on what you need in order to build those different buildings. And each card has a different ability that corresponds with the building once it is built. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to basically set up a game. We're going to choose one of each of these cards at random, and we're going to try and set up a game here. We're going to try and get all this stuff as out of the way as we can so we can try and get everything into one shot here so that we can best explain. This is the wrong way. Got our markets. Alrighty, so we have our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have our 7 building types for a standard game. Now, there is also these additional building types. However, with these additional cards, each player is randomly dealt one of these cards that can be a major benefit if they can actually get it built. Now, some of these are a little harder to build than others, but typically they have a better value. The harder they are to build, the better the card is, in most cases. So what we're going to do is we're just going to randomly give one of these to each player. And we'll go from there. The rest of them aren't used. So now that we have all of our different buildings all set up, these are what are going to be used for the rest of the game. So the way the game works is that, as you can see, on each of these different cards, there is a different layout of what materials you need, in what order you need them in order to build this building. And an example of the chapel, you gain 1 victory point for each fed cottage. And if you look at the cottages, which are in every game, you gain 3 victory points if this building is fed. So basically what it would be is that if you have a chapel and a cottage, you would gain 4 victory points for each cottage that is fed. And in order to feed said cottages, you need to build the farm, which feeds 4 buildings anywhere in your town. So it doesn't have to be on the same row or on the same column, but it will feed any 4 buildings anywhere in your town. Now, if we were to have something like the orchard, for say, it has a different pattern that you need in order to build it. You need 1 wood, 2 wheat, and a stone, whereas with the farm you need 2 wood and 2 wheat. However, the orchard it feeds all buildings in the same row and column. So depending on what card you end up with on each playthrough of the game, you have different abilities and different strategies that you need to think of in order to accomplish your goal of gaining the most victory points possible. So now that we have the general of what each card does once everything is set up, let's get on to gameplay. Now, each player plays more or less simultaneously, but you do still play in turn. Now, if I can find it in here. This is used to determine what player is going. If you're playing with a lot of people, I can see how this might be handy, but playing with 2 people, really, you just have to remember whose turn it is. But there is a nifty little meeple hammer in here in order to determine who's playing, whose turn it is. So on the player's turn, whoever it is that's going at the time, they will say what type of resource it is that they want. Now, each player both uses the building cards in play in order to build their town. So say player 1, let's say this player's going first, say player 1 wants to start trying to make some cottages to get ahead of things. And they say, well, I want a wheat. That player would take a wheat and they'd place it wherever they want to on their board. But what happens is that the opponent also needs to take a wheat and would also place that somewhere on their board. So the way that it works is that on a player's turn, they get to choose a block that they think might benefit them in the building of their town, and the opponent also has to build with the exact same resource. And this continues until a player decides that they've gotten the resources they need. So let's say this second player takes the wheat and they also want to try and build some cottages to get started. So they're like, oh, well, I want some glass. So both players would take a glass and say they were both trying to get their cottages up. So they're both going pretty quick. And then maybe let's say, oh, well, they might be able to get it over here as well, but I want to get a brick so I can get this cottage going. So both players are going to take a brick resource and they're going to place those pieces down. Now, at the end of your turn, if you have the correct pattern of a piece, now, to be fair, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly like this. You are allowed to rotate the pattern. So it could be set up in any of the 4 patterns of the rotated card, but they do have to be in this particular order. So at the end of your turn, if you have the amount of resources in the correct spot, you can remove the resources from their spot, and you can choose to build whatever building it is that you've done in any one of those 3 spaces that the resource took up. Now, play like this continues basically until the entire board is full. And at the end of the game, you would calculate victory points based on what you have made in your town. So let's just throw some stuff out here to kind of get an example of this, and we'll see kind of what's happening with the way it's going. So let's say player 3 got a few houses, but let's say player 4 got all of their houses. 4 houses. Over here, just kind of spread them out. Try and make it somewhat realistic here. It's very hard to plan this out without actually playing through a game, which is why it's a little tricky for me. Now, let's say both players were able to build their special cards here. So this player was able to build the Barrett Castle. If fed, counts as 2 cottages. So let's say these guys only got 3, but they actually got this guy up as well. And we'll say that the Grove University also got theirs up. Immediately place a building on an empty square in your town. So you could place a building anywhere, just say that, and you get 3 victory points for it. And then we'll say that these guys over here had a farm, which would feed all 4 of the cottages that they got set. What is our farm set up here? 2 and 2. Yep, that works. Let's say these guys set up a farm. Let's say these guys got a market. I realize I basically have these looking the same. I'm going to try and shift that a little bit. Let's say these guys had a market. 1 for each in the same row and column. So markets gain points based on how they're laid out. So let's say this person was able to get 3 markets somehow before they did all this other stuff. Let's say this guy was able to get a factory. Now the factories are interesting because, as you can see here, when constructed, place 1 of the 5 resources onto the factory. When another player names this resource, you may place a different resource instead. So when a factory is placed, you basically get to choose a resource. It's allowing you to say, maybe not have to play something that you may be oversaturated in. So if you felt that you didn't want to play more bricks, you could place a brick on top of that factory in order to avoid having to play bricks if your opponent calls out that they want a brick. Now, with some of these other ones, like the warehouse, for example, you get -1 victory point for each resource that is on top of the thing. So each factory can store 3 resources. When another player names a resource, you may place that resource on top of the factory or swap it with a resource that is on the factory. So you can do that a maximum of 3 times, but if you were to have 3 resources on top of that, you would lose 3 victory points at the end of the turn if the warehouse was in play. However, we have the factory, which allows us to not have to play a certain thing. Now we've also got the almshouse, which based on your constructed almshouses. So you would gain points dependent on how many you have. So if you've only built 1, you actually lose a victory point. If you have built 3, you lose 3 victory points. And if you have built 5, you lose 5 victory points. However, if you manage to build 6 almshouses, you gain 26 victory points, which is pretty crazy. That's a pretty crazy thing. So let's say that our guy on the right side here managed to build. Can we feasibly get 4 in here? 1, 2, 3. We could say get 1 there. Nope. Say get 1 there. 1, 2, 3. Could say get one there. 1, 2, 3. Could get one there. So you have 3 in a row there. And then possibly this person didn't build any almshouses. They were more focused on doing these marketplaces to try and get some more markets. And let's say the rest of these spaces here, doesn't seem like anyone really has any more spaces they could build more stuff on. So let's say the rest of these spaces were potentially built up with some wells and then just some random resources. Now, if I recall correctly, any space that you have at the end of the game with a resource on it that hasn't built a building actually ends up deducting points from your total score. So you basically want to try and get as many points or as many buildings onto your thing as possible. And then let's say there was just random resources on the rest of this. Wheat, so it would be wheat and thing. And what do we got? Two more basically. So let's say we got a wood, and then the last one, maybe a brick. So once a town is completely built up and finished, this is when you want to start calculating your points. So you would go one by one through all the stuff and start calculating. So each well that you have gains you 1 victory point for each adjacent cottage. So you would get 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point here, and 1 point here, because these all have adjacent cottages. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 victory points just off the cottages. And down here we would get 1 point, 2 points for the 2 adjacent cottages there. So we are currently at 5 to 2. And then we calculate our marketplaces. We get 1 point for each of the farms that are each of the markets that are in the same row or column, but not in both. So because we have 3 in one row, we gain 3 points. That puts us at 8 points, and our opponent had no markets, so they get 0 points. So it is still 8 to 2. Now we check our almshouses. Now this player had 0 almshouses, but this player had 3. And if you remember when we said 3, you actually deduct 3 points, which puts him into negative. So if you want to play negatives, currently at -1 point, 8 to -1 points. Now factories gain 0 points, so you can just skip over that. And cottages gain 3 points if this building is fed. And remember, our farms are what feed our building, and the farms give 4 buildings anywhere in your town food. So this player has 3 different cottages that can all be fed by this farm. So they're going to gain an additional, 3 points? 3, 6, 9 points, putting them, I think they were at 8, correct? So that would be 14 points. And this player is going to gain 3, 6, 9, as well as the 5 points if fed, and also counts as 2 cottages. Now, we gain 5 points for it being fed, but we do not gain the cottages. It counts as 2 cottages. So I guess if we had stuff beside it, it would count as points, but it gains 5 points because it's fed. So we don't have to worry about it counting as 2 cottages for the time being. Possibly if we had another farm, it counting as 2 cottages could be a thing, or if cottages had extra points. But because we only have 1 farm, we only feed 4 houses, and seeing as we already have 3 cottages and this guy, we're going to give 5 points plus 9 points, which is 14 points. So we have now kind of tied up. I think it's 8 plus 14 to 13. So pretty close, even though we lost a bunch of points from that other stuff. And then our farm has been dealt with, and we finally move on to our chapel, which is 1 point for each fed cottage. So we get 1, 2, 3 extra points on this side, putting us at, what was it? 5 plus 9, 14 plus 4, so 18. And 1, 2, 3, an extra 3 points on this. I think it was 13 or so 17 points. And then finally, you would calculate your cards. However, this one was calculated because it was calculated when we did the farms. But the Grove University gives 3 points and immediately places a building on an empty square in your town. So he gains an extra 3 points because of the Grove University being built, which means this player would actually end up winning just right off the end. And that's more or less how Tiny Towns works. It's a really fun game, and there's a lot of variety because the amount of different scenarios you can have with each deck of cards for the buildings can last quite a bit. Likewise, the special ability cards here, there's quite a large amount of special ability cards that each player can get. So especially if you're just playing with 2 players, those can last quite a while, and there's quite a lot of variety with those cards. But yeah, that is Tiny Towns. It's a really fun game, one of the earlier games that we got when we started collecting again, and it's one that I kind of hope that we start getting on the table a little more because I really enjoy it, and it's a fun game to play. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully you maybe gained a new appreciation for a game that you may possibly not have known about or have now become interested in. If you guys have played Tiny Towns, let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully I will see you all for the next video. But for the time being, just remember that board games are for everybody, and I hope I see you all next time. Peace.